Everyone except for the Mario Brothers likes turtles. The many indigenous peoples of the northeastern North American continent called their land, and possibly the planet itself, Turtle Island. The Iroquois, who once ruled over much of upstate New York and southeastern Ontario, told a tale of an island floating in tranquil space. The sky goddess fell down from a hole left by a fallen tree. Yes, I know this sounds like something you would get on an acid trip. And she was eventually rescued by birds who took her to safety, down to the waters that cover the earth below, from the heavens that she fell from. The turtle came up to rescue her, and many of the sea creatures piled dirt on top of the turtle's back, which made the turtle grow bigger and bigger until it became an island, and then a continent. That continent is what we now know as North America, or in the cases of the indigenous peoples, the world. After all, the Native Americans and the First Nations people were unaware of the rest of the world before the arrival of Europeans. So Turtle Island was, in fact, the world. Eventually, this patch of dirt atop a turtle's shell became lush with vegetation, fauna, and eventually humans. Turtle Island has been in more recent years used as a symbol of indigenous activism, signifying the original inhabitants of North America and their union with nature. Turtles, being the bedrock of the world, is not just relegated to First Nations peoples. Various other cultures included the world turtle as a motif, from India to China to elsewhere. The world on the back of a turtle is oftentimes used as an example of infinite regress in philosophy. The first or non-first causation. Take the idea of the world turtle. If the world is the top of a turtle, then what is a turtle sitting on? Well, maybe another turtle, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then it's turtles all the way down. The phrase, turtles all the way down, is used to illustrate the problems with causation and infinite regress. It is oftentimes used in arguments regarding the existence of God or who created the universe. How can something come from nothing? However, I would argue that such a problem is not really one of infinite regress, but rather the human mind's inability to understand such matters. How can one comprehend the first causation? Well, you know who can't comprehend first causation? Turtles. The first pets I ever had were actually 2 red-eared sliders and 2 Russian tortoises. And in homage to them, I want to make a video not covering the biology or ecology of the turtle, but rather the way in which turtles, tortoises, and terrapins have impacted human culture throughout history, in my ongoing series on human-animal relationships. While not our best friends, the dogs, or important transportation like horses, or food like chickens, or our executioners like mosquitoes, or even cute animals that we love but don't really care that much about us like cats, turtles nonetheless have played a significant role in human cultures around the world. An animal famous for its shell that provides them with not only a ribcage, but also protects them from some of the harshest elements nature has to offer. At this point in Earth's biological history, there are over 350 species of turtles, some of which inhabit the arid deserts, others lush freshwater rivers, and some swim across the vastness of the salty oceans. Some are found in forests, others in grasslands, others in canyons and reefs. Any ecosystem on the planet, with the exception of the most frigid tundra and the darkest ocean depths, will call turtles their home. Now, the most notable feature of the turtle is, of course, its shell, which is attached to its ribs. Contrary to what cartoons may tell you, turtles cannot leave their shell, unless you want to rip their flesh out of their skeleton, and dying is not a very good evolutionary strategy. The shells are, for the most part, made up of bones, which are made up of calcium. Calcium is to biology what steel is for civil engineering, providing a rigid, strong structure for organisms. The shells, for the most part, are usually plated, with additional armor made up of keratin. This substance is a series of fibrous proteins that make up your fingernails, along with the claws of a cat, the hooves of a horse, and the horn of a rhino. Keratin is one of the best forms of weaponry and biological armor. The hardness of keratin is both the sword and the shield of nature. Turtles, for the most part, focus on the shield. They have calcium-based bones and shells made up of both calcium and keratin, and the scales are by and large purely made out of keratin. I keep fluctuating between calling it keratin and keratin because I've heard both, but bear with me. Anyway, this makes them a biological fortress, protecting them from the harshest elements of nature. The combination of the carapace dome on the top with a flatter plate at the bottom creates a biological bunker, shielding the turtle from the elements and predators. Even their limbs and heads, which can usually retract into their body, are covered, to some extent with some pretty tough scales. Turtles, more than any other animal aside from maybe snails, have placed more points into defense, and with the exception of snapping turtles, many of them have not really placed that much emphasis on hunting or any other form of aggression. Most tortoises on land will eat a diet almost exclusively on plants, and sea turtles mostly eat algae, seagrass, and seaweed, and a few invertebrates here and there. Terrapins, or freshwater turtles, are the most prone to eating flesh, but at the end of the day, most of them are fine with eating plant matter as well. Sure, there are some outliers, like the snapping turtle, a creature that can pretty much break every stereotype about turtles, but by and large, most species of terrapins and tortoises are peaceful. By and large, when they do eat meat, it's usually as a last resort, or basically just eating small invertebrates that lack the cuteness for humans to really care about them. On top of that, turtles by and large live for a long period of time. Tortoises in particular live the longest lives, one of the few types of animals which lives longer than the average human. The individual Galapagos tortoise, Harriet, lived till the age of 175 years. Taken by Charles Darwin from Ecuador in 1835 to Australia, he eventually died in the Australia Zoo in 2006. By the way, the Australia Zoo is owned by the Steve Irwin family, the crocodile hunter. The Galapagos tortoise, which I had the pleasure of seeing during my trip to Ecuador a few years ago, are the largest land-dwelling, cold-blooded creatures on the planet, living in the Galapagos Islands, which translates into the Tortoise Islands, where Darwin discovered evolution and more specifically natural selection. The Galapagos are kind of like a scientific Garden of Eden, as the animals have been in isolation from humans for so long, on a series of islands distant from any major terrestrial predators to the point where the animals don't act out of fear. These tortoise shells played a particularly substantial role in Darwin's studies on natural selection. He noticed, for example, that tortoises would look different depending on the type of food and environment that they were consuming and living in respectively. For example, tortoises that had cacti with tall, hanging fruit resulted in the tortoises on the island having longer necks. However, islands with rougher, low-lying foliage resulted in more compact tortoises. There are numerous subspecies of the Galapagos tortoise, one of the most famous being on the island of Pinta, which went extinct. The last survivor was Lonesome George, who died in 2012, bringing an end to the Pinto Galapagos tortoises. Lonesome George, unfortunately, was not a Chad and did not produce a lot of offspring. However, another Galapagos tortoise from another species by the name of Diego was so horny that he saved the species from extinction. He pounded those Stacies like a true Giga Chad turtle. Speaking of the way Diego prolonged his species and how long he lived, I want to focus a little bit more on longevity. Tortoises, as stated before, live longer than humans and are one of the very few animals to do so, and even terrapins and sea turtles live pretty impressively long lives. There are various hypotheses behind this, from slow growth rates to slow metabolic rates to the fact that they have giant shells that basically make them immune from most predators. Perhaps because they are immune from most predators, they can focus on traits that allow them to live longer. Regardless of the biological reason, this has resulted in them becoming symbols of a long, peaceful, tranquil life in the eyes of various cultures. Such a long, peaceful life is rather atypical for nature, which is red in tooth and claw. In many ways, turtles, more than any other animal, aside from the modern human, have been sheltered, literally, from the harshest realities of nature. And sure, this has come at the cost of speed, being one of the slowest animals on the planet, but I'd rather be slow and safe than die 150,000 kilometers per hour during rush hour. This sort of similarity to the human experience, the ability to shelter oneself from the elements of nature, and to live a very long life is what makes turtles a source of fascination for many cultures around the world. Across various cultures, turtles have been symbols of wisdom, longevity, patience, and tranquility. In West Africa, turtles were seen by the Yoruba people, one of the major ethnic groups of Nigeria, as smart creatures, which seem slow and unthreatening at first glance, but would oftentimes be clever enough to outplay other characters. This trope has been seen in Greece with Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare, a story you're probably familiar with, but perhaps didn't know comes from an ancient Greek slave. The story involves a hare or rabbit that mocks the slow tortoise, and then the two end up in a race in which the hare gets lazy, stops while the tortoise keeps pressing forward and wins. The story has been often used to illustrate the power of grit over innate qualities, persistence over giving up, and humility over arrogance, along with the power of delayed gratification over instant gratification. There are multiple variations of the story and countless adaptations from cartoons to live-action plays. In Chinese civilization, turtles oftentimes were a symbol of longevity as well, fitting for a culture that itself has had better longevity than nearly any other throughout history. While modern Egypt is vastly culturally different than ancient Egypt, Mexico is vastly different than the Olmecs, and India today is vastly different from the pre-Indo-European Indus River Valley civilizations, China, in many ways, has its roots in the first complex settlements on the Yellow River. For this reason, turtles play a very important role as a revered animal, only beaten by the tiger, dragon, and a few others. And if I were to bring this back to pop culture, the game, World of Warcraft, has the Pandarian starting zone based on the back of a turtle, and it has its own Chinese civilization on top of it. Sound familiar? On the Indian subcontinent, Hinduism has its own story of the world turtle. A story of a world sitting on the back of an elephant on top of a turtle. The Abrahamic views of turtles are all over the place. Turtles were prohibited from being eaten under Jewish law alongside pigs and shrimp, which I guess was good for the turtles. Turtles don't play a particularly important or prominent role in Christianity, as say sheep or goats or fish, but they are sometimes seen as symbols of Christian virtues such as patience and peace, but also creatures who are slow carrying. They have the burden of their sins on top of their shells, apparently. Sea turtles have also been depicted as symbols of good luck and guidance by Allah in Islamic culture, which is not surprising as the religion began near the coral-rich Red Sea, and they would probably see these sea turtles quite often as they would go on voyages. While it is true that the adult sea turtle is oftentimes shielded from the harshest realities of nature, the same is not true for their babies. Sea turtles will lay over 100 eggs, and only 1 or 2 will survive to adulthood. This has resulted in an epic race of survival for a fierce few. The few that do go on to grow up will one day return to the beach that they laid eggs on, thus continuing the cycle. The sea turtle's life cycle is one of the most captivating, covering themes of brutality, resilience, determination, and nostalgia all in one. A beautiful natural narrative. There are countless other stories from ancient tales created by humans, in religious scripture and oral traditions all about turtles, but I'll skip over them to focus on one from modern-day pop culture. One that is quite possibly the least featured yet most memorable characters in Looney Tunes, and that was Cecil the Turtle, who races Bugs Bunny and beats him in a modern rendition of Aesop's tale of the tortoise and the hare. Cecil the Turtle is one of the very few characters in the cartoon series who outwits Bugs Bunny. During the Super Mario Bros. Movie, Mario explains to Peach that he is perplexed at how turtles are depicted as bad guys in the Mushroom Kingdom, a bit unusual given that turtles tend to have a positive image in Japanese culture as well. But I'm not going to bother finding a rational explanation for a fictional universe filled with talking mushroom people and hills that have eyes. Let's move on to Pokemon, one of the most prominent pieces of Japanese pop culture. And the original 150 Pokemon includes Squirtle, Wartortle, and Blastoise. Squirtle is one of the most iconic Pokemon, aside from Pikachu, Mewtwo, and this, well, racist-looking thing. Squirtle is shilled for countless pieces of merchandise. And if we go back a decade before the 90s into the 80s, we'll see that this wasn't a new phenomenon. After all, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles started off as a comic parody of Batman and Daredevil before becoming a children's show, as well as a handful of crappy movies produced by Michael Bay. Unfortunately, turtles in the real world aren't doing as tubular. Over half of them are currently threatened significantly due to human habitation. The hardest hit are the sea turtles, affected by water pollution, climate change, and as much as I'd like to deny it, the pet industry has also played a role. The red-eared slider, the first pet I ever had, common in the pet trade due to their long lifespan and hardiness, has oftentimes been released into the wild, outcompeting native species, as has the soft shell turtle. Sea turtles have become an icon of conservation themselves, as they are oftentimes some of the most vulnerable to climate change. Many of them are facing issues due to bycatch, as well as them mistaking plastic bags for jellyfish, which leads to them choking. This has resulted in them becoming a symbol for non-governmental organizations for their conservation marketing campaigns. While turtles have been shielded from some of the worst elements of nature, their hard shells have proven to be less suitable to protecting them from some of the harshest realities of humans. If we value longevity, then perhaps we should make the world a place where turtles, humans, and other creatures can live out a long life. Healthy, happy lives. Except for mosquitoes. Fuck them.